Good morning and welcome to the fourth meeting of this session of the Economy, Jobs and Fair Work Committee. Might I remind all present to turn their electronic devices to silent or switch them off if they're liable to interfere with the sound system. And also may I welcome our witnesses whom we'll introduce in a minute. The first decision is a decision to take items 3 and 4 on the agenda in private. Are we all agreed on that?
Yes.
Thank you. So I'll now come to our witnesses. The committee is considering the climate change plan and energy strategy. The witnesses with us today are Professor Sean Smith, who is Director of the Institute for Sustainable Construction and Professor of Construction Innovation at Edinburgh Napier University. So good morning and welcome, Professor. Our next witness, moving from my left to right, is Elizabeth Layton, who is Policy Advisor for the Existing Homes Alliance Scotland, and a good morning and welcome to you as well. Next is Elaine Watterson, Strategy Manager of the Energy Saving Trust. Good morning. And finally, Andrew Mowat, who is the Principal Officer regarding carbon management for Glasgow City Council. Now, I would ask the witnesses to keep their answers succinct, and the committee members will no doubt seek to do the same. You don't need to answer every question, and if you want to come in on a particular issue, then please simply indicate by raising your hand. No need to do anything with the buttons in front of you. The sound desk will take care of that. So I would like to start with a fairly general question. I know some of you have submitted written evidence to the committee, but perhaps each of you could take a moment just to outline very briefly what you consider to be key points, positive or of concern, in the climate change plan and the energy strategy. And perhaps I'll start with Andrew Mowat and move across from right to left on this occasion.
Thank you, Chair. In general terms, I think both documents are very good, pretty all-encompassing, give a good background, and then go on to lay out exactly how the Scottish Government intends to deliver upon these points. My one point of concern is how heavily reliant it seems to be on carbon capture and storage. Whilst I do believe it is a technology that should be considered, that there's a whole half page dedicated to it, and I would urge ministers to maybe consider that and how it affects the overall sort of ongoing ambitions and targets.
Thank you. Elaine Watterson.
I think we were really pleased to see the ambition of the target reductions for the residential sector. So the 76% reduction. That's really positive, and also very pleased to see that the vision around having 80% of households connected to low carbon heating by 2032. I think our concern is around whether or not more should be done in terms of doing the energy efficiency stuff more quickly, and also possibly around that 80% target. While it's a great vision to have, the detail on how we get there obviously isn't there yet, and to some extent that's understandable, but it would be good to have a little bit more detail about what that means in practice.
Thank you. Elizabeth Layton.
Okay, thank you. And just to say, for those who might not be aware, the Existing Homes Alliance is a coalition of bodies representing housing, anti-poverty and environmental sectors. Likewise, I support what EST's comment about the ambitious vision for the housing and residential sector of homes being highly efficient, and most of them being heated by low carbon heat. We think that is the right vision. That's where we need to be in terms of climate change, but also importantly in terms of fuel poverty, because after all, the most important thing we can do for those who are fuel poor is to reduce their need to heat at all, so that's the best way to make sure we're putting money in their pockets as opposed to paying for high cost of heat. But very concerned, and I think we've outlined this in our briefing, that there is quite a significant credibility gap. We think it's right to have that ambition, but it shouldn't just be wishful thinking. It needs to be backed up by credible policies and resources that give us the confidence that that target will be met. And not only us the confidence, but gives the marketplace the confidence, gives householders the confidence that that is definitely the direction we're going. And so we think we need to focus on filling that credibility gap with new policies and proposals and firm interim targets in the final climate change plan.
Thank you. Professor Smith.
Generally, we're very supportive of their targeting measures, particularly for fuel poor, as has been mentioned by others, and people in low-income key groups. The previous efforts around about renewables and other reduction measures in industries, such as the closure of coal-fired power stations, has all helped reduce the carbon emissions. In terms of the aspect of forestry, which we may not go into today, but just to touch on, we're very supportive of accelerating more homegrown timber into our construction products and timber products for housing. We have enough timber to build 3 million homes from our Scottish forest, and it supports 16,000 jobs. So the efforts there to plant more trees and various other things and support the timber development programme, which the Government and Forestry Commission and industry undertake, is really very supportive of that direction. In terms of transport, which interlinks, I think it'd be useful to come back to that as a holistic approach, maybe later on in the discussions today, and the influence around building standards and Section 7 sustainability, because the plans afoot for electric vehicles we're supportive of. I think it's how we then incorporate that into some of the legislation or regulations going forward, so it links together.
Thank you very much. I'll open up to general questions from other committee members. Gillian Martin.
Andrew Mowat picked on something that jumped out at me as well. I come from the area very nearby where Peterhead had the carbon capture storage pilot programme that the funding was taken away from. How do you see the research in that getting to a point where that's achievable, given that that funding was taken away from that project by the UK government?
I must admit, I don't know. I don't know that it's, given the resource we have in Scotland for renewable energy, I'm not convinced it's something we even really need to consider. And the fact that there's been so much funding available, given that, granted there was taken away, given that there has been over the last 10 years even so much funding available for the technology, I would suggest that it would have progressed now had there been a viable option for it. Unlike renewables, which has increased exponentially over the same period. Specifically on Peterhead, I don't know the detail, I'm afraid.
Are you concerned that carbon capture is not going to be the answer to reducing our carbon emissions, and that we should just scrap it altogether and look for alternative means, or are you?
Essentially, yeah, I think it's almost an excuse to continue to burn fossil fuels when, particularly in this country, I don't believe that's necessary.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Bill Bowman.
Could I ask Elizabeth Layton, who I think spoke about getting marketplace and householders' confidence, could you just tell me a little bit more about what you meant by that?
Sure. Yes, as I said, the ambition that is set out in the plan provides a signal to industry that government is serious about this the low carbon pathway for housing, and that it makes sense to invest in capacity and skills in manufacturing of low carbon technologies for homes. But if the policies and programs aren't there to back that up, and so that both the homeowners believe that that's a direction of travel through either support for regulation, but also signals through nudges like incentives that can be provided, tax incentives, they understand that's a direction, then there isn't a belief that people will take up these measures, because after all, it's not all going to be dealt with through grants and programs to fuel poor. We have to talk about the whole marketplace of owner-occupiers as well, which is why I was going to just highlight this. This is a graph that appears in the climate change plan of the trajectory that's planned. And, you know, this is the concern that we're talking about is what happens, you know, suddenly there's going to be this huge drop, which will be, you know, dealing with the low carbon heat. But we feel there's much, much more that can be done during this period now, where the measures are available in terms of loft insulation. There's 600,000 lofts yet to be done, 600,000 cavity walls yet to be done, thousands, hundreds of thousands of solid wall insulation. And these are all measures that would make a huge difference for the fuel poor, as well as helping address emissions reductions and setting us up for when those low carbon technologies come into play. Because after all, things like heat pumps work most effectively if the fabric of the house has been insulated as well. So we think there are several, you know, steps. We think, you know, almost you could address about 30% of our housing stock could be brought on to low carbon heat during these first few years of the program. We don't need to wait.
Could you give us the reference or page of the chart that you held up, just for the record and for future reference?
That's figure 7. Sorry, I don't have the page number. It's figure 7 from the plan.
Section 8.2.
Thank you.
Page 48.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
To say, so we need to take people with us, not just tell them what to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Certainly, yes. Gil Patterson.
Something, I think we know that in relative terms that local authorities and housing associations, that they're pretty proactive, and, you know, we're doing reasonably well in that sector. But when it comes to the private sector, this is both in terms of housing and industrial, commercial, etc. When it comes to individuals privately spending their money, then there is a reluctance. I need to follow that through. The business that I own, I've got a number of buildings. Some of them are very old, very, very difficult. But the new one, it was in my control, so everything was done. So regulation kind of takes care of that. How do we make the step change from what happens in the public sector, where we're doing reasonably well, but when it comes to the private sector, we failed? Does that, if I should pose a question, does it take regulation to do that? Or do we just leave it the way it is?
Well, I think I welcome the question, because that is something in the climate change plan, which is a good thing. There is a mention that they are going to consult on regulation for the private rented sector on minimum standards of energy performance, and that consultation is expected in, I think, later next month. And I think regulation is necessary to, you know, work on the bottom of the heap, in a sense, the worst performing properties, which are really sort of flatlining along. They're not picking up. And this will give the, you know, sort of the push to get those properties up to a minimum standard of energy performance, while at the same time you're using incentives, advice, support to pull others along to go higher up the energy performance certificate scale. We also recognize in the plan that there's an acknowledgement that they will look at, the government is going to look at a phased approach to regulation for the rest of the private sector. And we think that there should be regulation of the owner-occupied sector as well. After all, if you're only dealing with the rented sector, that'll be about 1/3 of the properties, which leaves us with the bulk of the properties not really addressed. And so we would urge that that is brought forward very quickly, and so we have a level playing field across the private housing stock. We can see how regulation has worked so well in the social housing sector. So private tenants and owners should benefit from the same good energy performance that gives us all the benefits of health and well-being, as well as saving us money.
Professor Smith.
Yeah, I'd very much support that, and I think as you mentioned, what's happened with the public sector and how they've rallied to meet some of the challenges to retrofit and other things has been very positive. The private sector, one would say maybe we've tackled this a bit late. Maybe we should have done this a few years ago. England is considering the same. Roughly, on new build, for example, whilst we have legislation for that, they represent 10 to 15% of all home transactions in Scotland. So let's say there's 200,000 properties which are sold across the piece in Scotland in any 1 year, new build and existing. So with that in mind, you have the ability, perhaps, if we give the industry enough time, because we need to skill up for this, given the scale, if people know if they had to sell a house in a particular few years' time and it had to be at Band C, then they've got time for the industry and the private rented sector, or if you're letting a private rented sector, you've got time to gear up for that. So there's one thing bringing out legislation, which helps drive it as a stick, but you've got to give people enough time to be ready for that and have the solutions available or the SMEs ready to react to that.
Elaine Watterson.
Just to add to that, I mean, just to emphasize the fact that, you know, there are various ways of kind of softening the blow of regulation around providing zero interest loans for people, and also for the fuel poor, obviously providing grants so that they have the ability to bring their homes up to any regulated standard. And also I think it's really important to remember that for householders, regulation is already in place for things like boilers. When someone replaces their boiler, they do need to install a boiler of a certain energy efficient standard. So the regulation already exists. It's not something completely new for the household sector.
Thank you. John Mason.
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, some of the previous questions have kind of sparked questions in my mind, and especially following on from Gillian Martin and this whole carbon capture and storage. I mean, I don't know if anyone else is wanting to comment on that. I mean, I've always been puzzled by this, because if we're producing something bad and then we just kind of stick it in the ground or keep it somewhere, that strikes me as not sustainable. On the other hand, I mean, there is a suggestion that carbon can be reused in the chemical industry or something like that. I mean, can any of you comment or guide me, because I'm not an expert in this field, you know, is carbon capture and storage as good as using hydro, or are we not comparing like with like?
It's not like for like when you compare it against any renewable source, I would argue. And when you're talking about capturing from a manufacturing process and reusing that carbon, that's very different from considering carbon capture and storage, which is, as you allude to there, is almost an indefinite storage of the emissions in an underground well or a facility of some description. I just feel that the amount of energy and money and resource that would go into establishing the industry could be better spent elsewhere, that in an area that's already delivering results. I mean, we're generating, what, 57% of electricity from renewables already, and it almost feels like we haven't really tried that hard. And so I just feel it's a distraction.
Okay, I'm guided that actually we're getting more about this next week when we have a witness that's a kind of expert on this, so I'll not ask any more questions on that. Yes. I've got something else, or do you want me?
No, I was just saying, put me on the list.
Right.
Okay.
Right, we'll just carry on. The private sector was mentioned, which I think is interesting, this retrofitting and all the rest of it. And immediately I'm thinking, well, where's the cost coming from that? I mean, can we do that kind of thing by regulation? Can we just tell owner-occupiers that they have to retrofit their houses, as we can tell the builders, presumably, that they have to build decent houses to start with? Or is it inevitable that there's got to be a pretty hefty grants scheme tied in with any retrofitting for owner-occupiers?
Elizabeth Layton.
Yes, on regulation, I think it can be introduced in a way that you should never really have to enforce it. It should be easy for people to comply. The standard should be set at a level that is relatively, quite affordable. It's easy to do. It's basically just setting a standard that people have to put in place those very common sense measures like hot water tank jackets, loft insulation, draft proofing, quite basic measures that really are just common sense, and it's reasonable to expect that that would be a minimum standard. And it could be done at the change of lease, so it's easier for a landlord to do it when there might be a vacancy there. And also you could do it, as Sean was suggesting, when the property turns over, so at point of sale. So if the owner if the seller rather didn't want to incur that cost themselves, they could actually defer that or transfer that obligation to the buyer. And in that case, it could be picked up through the sale of the house property. And
flat, the owner, before the new owner moved in, they would have to upgrade or something like that?
Or you might have a period of time, you know, you might have a certain number of months by which they would have to upgrade the flat and present their energy performance certificate saying, I have met that standard. So there are ways to do it to make it easy for people and for them to recognize, see what benefits they're achieving, and it's not a huge financial burden. But at the same time, I agree with what Elaine was saying, that it does need to be supported by extensive advice and support from the Home Energy Scotland network, loans, there are already zero interest loans available, and grants who aren't able to pay, because we must make sure that any regulation doesn't disadvantage those who are fuel poor, but on the contrary, that they are benefiting from regulation.
Well, it's been going so far, because there's been various schemes to replace boilers and improve insulation and some of these kind of things. Have they been, is it just more of that we need to do?
I think it is, we do need to up our level of ambition. As I said with the graph I was showing that's showing us, and the tables in the climate change plan suggest that the numbers of measures that would be installed through right the way through to 2032 stays static at 90,000. And the SPICE report that just came out on the climate change plan notes that in 2014-15, the number of measures that were being installed was 87,000. So that seems to me a bit business as usual rather than a national infrastructure priority on energy efficiency, which is transformational and moving us towards a housing stock that is truly low carbon. So yes, we need to up the amount of measures that are going into homes, and that will have to be done through a whole package of measures that will include regulation, but not wholly rely on regulation. It will have to rely on people doing voluntarily uptaking measures as well.
I mean, that kind of ties into my final question, if I may, Convener, which is, how does this new climate change plan relate to the previous RPP 1 and 2 that we've had? I mean, do you see them as continuations, or are they a change of direction, or just a kind of change of speed?
Convener, if I may, I've brought a graph. It's not digital, but I've brought some copies, which might explain that, if that's of any help.
Certainly, if you want to provide these to us, and perhaps if it could be emailed into the clerks after the session so that we have a digital copy.
So yes, how do the documents relate to each other? Well, whilst other sectors in transport and various other things by the means of how we move or our energy supplies changes, the residential sector is generally fairly static in the sense of that it doesn't change. We already have most of the existing properties here, and what will happen over the next coming years will probably add 15 to 20% of the stock by 2050. If you can see the graph in front of you, what we've done is we've brought together the RPP1, RPP2, and I don't think we're allowed to call it RPP3 now, although we will do for the purpose of this, if I may, but the draft climate change plan. Let me just take you through the graph. The blue dotted line at the top represents the business as usual as forecast in RPP1. So the graph you're seeing here is residential. It's the reductions or planned reductions in million tons of CO2 emissions. So the blue dashed line is business as usual, as forecast back in about 2008 with RPP1. The light blue line represents what RPP1 forecast and planned from the policies that they laid out of the direction of travel. And as you can see, it reduces from about 7 in 2010 to about 5 in 2021, 2022. The orange line is the planned forecast of policies and outcomes and reduction emissions for RPP2. The black line is the most latest document, which is the expected and planned reductions using the policies. So let me just explain. So that difference in 2017 suggests that the current plan of policies on carbon reduction for residential is significantly higher than what was previously planned, in the sense of there will be more leakage of carbon emissions because it's above the orange and red line. We then continue on.
Dotted line, isn't it?
It is.
As if we'd done nothing?
As if we'd done nothing. It then slopes down quite steeply and then plateaus. And then the key issue is then what happens after 2025. Because if, and this is where I will defend Scottish Government, because there's lots of, no matter the political party, there are lots of issues that are happening from UK which affect the decisions of what we do up here and also what we can enforce as policies, whether it be feed-in tariffs, the ecosystems, or various other things that are going on, any energy company obligations. But if we don't hit these preset targets in RPP1 or RPP2, what happens is, as we get to this document, equivalent to the RPP3, you then squeezed into those last 7 years between 2025 and 2032, the key push to get to that target you need by 2032. Now, to give you an idea of just the scale of what's going to be required, and this is where I'll touch base with the Existing Homes Alliance and the work that they have produced, we still have another 900,000 homes to retrofit. That's quite a significant task. There's been some great work already. I've seen it in my local village. I've seen the changes to people's lives. They've talked about how warm their homes are now and the difference. Not all, but the majority talk about it and the benefits they see. With the remaining time that we have, if we targeted a band C for energy performance for these homes, the 900,000, and we really went for 2025 rather than 2032, because I think it's quite difficult to go to the public and say, I'm sorry, you're going to have to wait 15 years till 2032 till we retrofit your house, or we have that measure in place. So whether it's through grant availability, whether it's through legislation, whether it's a carrot where we reduce the land and transactions buildings tax for those that go to a band C, if we go for 900,000 homes by 2025, we need to retrofit one home every minute with the available time that we have till 2025. So probably in the course of this meeting this morning, the first hour, we should have retrofitted 60 homes if we have to get on target. I hope that explains where we see the RPP1s to RPPs.
Andy Whiteman.
Thank you, Convener. Get my head around those figures in due course. A couple of questions. One, the plan, policy outcome 1 in the residential sector seeks improvements to the fabric of Scotland's domestic buildings, resulting in a 6% reduction in their heat demand by 2032. We've been advised that that 6% reduction is not from a baseline of today or 1990 or whenever, but in fact is a reduction on the projected heat demand in 2032. I'm just wondering whether you have any ideas of whether there is what should be the accepted baseline for measuring reduction in heat demand?
I'm not sure if I'd respond directly to the question, but I do know that, and our analysis of the UK Committee on Climate Change's pathway to 2032 suggests a 8% reduction on heat demand. So we're thinking it's not as strong as that, but I'm not an expert on that. I think there'll be people on the next panel who might be able to answer that.
Part of that demand will be no doubt influenced by occupants' behaviour, and the data we have from a number of studies across Scotland where people have had access to real-time displays. So I think we also can just differentiate between what's a smart meter that sits under your stair or a cupboard and actually someone visually seeing on the display. So most of the smart meters coming out just now will come with an in-home display so they can see and identify how much energy they're using and on the demand side around their home. We did a study where we used real-time displays with good color graphics in explaining to people easily how they're using electricity and gas and water. We found that there was a 7% reduction in the use of electricity, but this was clearly seen. We had also exactly the same sizes of homes, same income groups and other houses that didn't have the display, so we had the direct comparator. And where they had gas, they could use, coming to the heat side, they reduced their gas consumption by 20%. Now, over a period of time, we've gone back to these properties over the last 3 years. And people are looking less at their in-home display because they've already started to change their behaviour. They know what parts of radiators, other aspects, and their thermometers, the things they want to change in the house. So as a result, there is the behavioural change. There is a slip back occasionally, but they do find that where it says you have gone over, or that's flashing in a certain amount, or there's a certain red light coming on that's telling them they're using much more, they find that extremely useful because then they can re-benchmark and reset. So it's 6% by fabric, which is a different aspect in terms of the insulation. Probably I would say 8 or 9% is more likely.
But the question is, what is the baseline for that 6% reduction?
Good point. They don't state what their baseline is.
Okay, so we need to do some work on that.
Yes. There's a number of questions we have about statistics and other things in here which we'd like to raise some queries on and raise to the committee's attention.
And you will be raising them?
We will do. We'll probably mention a couple today, but we will write in as well.
That would be very helpful. My second point is really in relationship to Elizabeth Layton's reference to wishful thinking. I mean, I think all witnesses have said that the targets, the ambition is good, but the Existing Homes Alliance, I think you refer to the fact that it lacks, these targets are not backed up by what you call credible policies or proposals. Could you say a little bit more about that? What would credible policies or proposals look like? Would they, for example, be very specific numbers, very specific actions, very specific timetables, and very specific costs?
Okay, in our briefing that we put out, and we will also submit more detailed evidence in the call for written evidence, we suggested improvements that could be made to the plan that we think would help fill that credibility gap. In terms of energy efficiency, we think there does need to be an interim milestone to indicate the trajectory, the increase in the pace and scale of improving the fabric of our homes up to an energy performance scale certificate, band C by 2025. So this would be doing your lofts, cavities, walls, all that. And this is very similar to the trajectory in the UK CCC pathway. So we're pretty much in agreement there, and it's similar to the number of measures that the Scottish Government is proposing over the whole period of 2032 to 2032. So the analysis is, very similar, but it's the timescale that's quite different. So that's number one. Quicken the pace and doing the fabric measures. In terms of low carbon heat, don't wait till 2025. We have just a slight increase between now and 2020, up by a few percentage points. We think much more could be done, as I mentioned earlier, up to about, at least 30%. I've been able to sketch out could be done by addressing the off-gas grid properties, getting them all onto heat pumps, or if those that are on electric heat already, either heat pumps or much more efficient electric heating. And then there's all the district heating urban networks that are waiting to be developed. These are things that are on the shelf, or should be on the shelf, ready to go, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be taken forward from now through to that 2025 period. So we could already, as I say, be at about 30% that are on low carbon heat by then, much quicker than what's suggested in this plan. So those are two items in terms of time scale and targets. So you could have interim targets on both fabric and low carbon heat. And how do you do it? Well, we need to move much faster on regulation. We've already discussed the benefits of bringing in regulation and the incentives that would go alongside that. That's being consulted on now, but there could be much firmer proposals brought forward in those consultations in terms of timescales and how quickly they could be brought in. And there would also be, I have to mention the budget. I know that's something that is, will be under consideration going through the Parliament. And the budget is basically standstill. And the programme for government suggests that and in this plan suggests the budget will stay the same over the next 4 years. And I think you need an increase in resources that would be consistent with having a national infrastructure priority. It's supposed to be a transformational, a different way of doing energy efficiency. But the numbers in front of you and the trajectory suggests it's doing much the same. So resources, targets, policies should be represented in the final plan.
Professor Smith.
We also raised this in RPP2 because if anyone's looked at RPP2, there was the wonder graph with the additional technical advantages, etc., measures, but it wasn't explained. And not only ourselves, but others did. Whilst we supported the targets, we did challenge the lack of information that was there in RPP2. So in the final version of RPP2, in section 5.4.21, they stated they intend to produce a detailed proposal and how they may realise this potential on these higher technologies happening further up the chain, as it were, further in the timescale, in the RPP3 document. But in this document, it is not there. And now, coming to the question raised about what sort of information, I think it's the proportionality, so how might be district, community, low carbon heat, how might be through other measures, just as a proportion of how they're going to arrive at this, rather than just this. I mean, this will require a seismic shift after 2025, not only for this country, for many, many other countries who are in the same boat with existing housing stock. There's a series of technologies that will need to be developed and tested and tried. Interestingly, when it comes to the retrofit of community heating or other district heating, it is not as straightforward, sadly. There are all sorts of issues with curtilage, access, various other issues to do with the costs and delays. However, on some of the new build developments, or where there are plans for new housing, there is the potential with, and I think some of the plans that are being put forward by the proposed city and regional deal, for example, for Edinburgh and South East Scotland, have plans to embed and look at the use of and widening of community and district heating with the new housing, linking to other hubs, other infrastructure surrounding schools, leisure centres, etc. The perfect example of sort of community district heating being put in is the Commonwealth Games Athletes Village. We were involved with part of that with the Commonwealth Legacy team. It was a tremendous achievement. The excess heat is helping to support the cycle track, which needs 26 degrees constant temperatures, so there was an outflow for that excess heat. But the actual special pipe work that was required in some of these projects, we had to import from Russia. So if we're going to, through insulated pipe works, so if we're going to go down this particular stretch, then we need to work with the enterprise bodies, innovation hubs, innovation support centres to make sure we have the products and supports and manufacturing, because it would be a very successful way to tackle low carbon heat, but we don't want to be importing all the solutions.
Thank you. Andy Whiteman, a brief follow-up and then come to Ash Denham.
Well, it's just I want a slightly different question about local government. I'm just wondering, to what extent do you feel local government owns this plan? I mean, it's going to have a lot of responsibilities in terms of delivery. Do you think it's got the resources and the powers to do so?
I think resource is always going to be something we could use more of. I'm perhaps going to bounce that back to you, if I may, and suggest that the Scottish Government could do slightly more in the politest possible way to help facilitate some of the requirements that this plan will have. And if we go to the Athletes' Village as an example, the way district heat and pipework is treated in terms of the non-domestic rates is one such example of the Scottish Government dealing with another Scottish Government department, and the price that the rates are applied at for district heating is the same as those applied at for the gas network, and clearly they're two very different things. And that in itself, a very, very small thing, can make the difference between a viable project in terms of the business case and an unviable project. So yes, I think that the local authority has a huge role to play in terms of facilitating, for example, district heating networks, and I believe we are making some strides in that, but we do need national support in that front as well.
Okay. Thank you. Ash Denham.
I think Professor Smith made the point about you know, the importance of the retrofitting the existing homes really well in one of your earlier answers. And you mentioned, you know, a possible incentive of maybe reducing LBTT for people who got their energy performance certificate up to a certain level, maybe a C. But am I right in thinking that there are problems with the EPC? I've heard of homes that are eco homes, that don't have central heating, they have high levels of insulation, and they're heated by wood, and yet when you feed that into the computer program, somehow it doesn't accept the parameters because it doesn't understand, it doesn't fit in with the way the computer system's set up, and so the EPC rating that's coming out is not a high rating. Do you think that's a widespread problem?
So I had it with my own home. When the surveyor came round, poor thing, I don't think he knew what he was in for. And we had a discussion because we'd added a front porch, as an example. Our ancestors didn't get it wrong when they put front porches into houses because the air changes by just opening your front door and having to reheat is significant. Interesting to see now quite a few of the house builders are now looking to bring back porches onto new build, which is really good to see. But it didn't count towards anything. So we had secondary front door. We'd even replaced the front door to be a really top-end thermally insulating front door. It didn't make a difference to the EPC. We put in solar or PV. They said it's not going to make a difference. We're looking at the fabric. So I was kind of thinking, I mean, maybe it's been changed since then, but it was pretty depressing. Having spent the money, done the measures, we're more comfortable for it, but it didn't reflect in the EPC rating. So I think the EPC actually needs a full overhaul, if I could be so blunt. And the sooner that happens, the better. But that, I think, is a UK-wide issue. But it's something which really needs to happen so we can take account of some of the newer developments that have happened.
Got any ideas about how many properties are potentially miscategorized, or, you know, in that way?
I think because the EPC current categorization is written in stone by the software or what the information that's input, they wouldn't be regarded as being miscategorized. I think it's a difference of opinion, coming to the point you raised about, look, someone's done all this, there's an eco house, they're not burning gas, they're doing something else, but it's not being reflected. So it would be interesting that if we were to take, let's say, a sample, and then actually ask through that sample, if we were to change the metrics to take account of these, how many homes might then change? I think that would be useful to see and to do.
I think Andrew Mowat wanted to come in this, and then Elizabeth Layton.
Just one point on EPCs. I think part of the issue there is that the actual performance of a building versus the design performance don't often correlate particularly well. But equally, the results after an EPC is done are not necessarily fed back into the program. So we're not getting that continual evolution of the program and the resultant improvements.
I was just going to say, with regard to EPCs, to differentiate between what's good about EPCs and what are the problems, and what's good about them is that people do understand and relate to that scale, like because they've had it for years with appliances, now with cars, with homes, and so I think that's something good that we should stick with. But I agree there are improvements that need to be made to the assessment methodology, and as Sean said, that is being done through the UK process. I think they've just closed a consultation on this latest round of improvements. And so there may be ways, and the Scottish Government's very aware of this, about how they might have to have some kind of parallel, looking at how the EPC rating and then perhaps something that takes into account the low carbon heat, because that's not very well represented. Whereas the EPC is much more focused on energy efficiency, which is fine as long as that's recognized. So let's not throw EPCs out. Let's fix the underpinning methodology and maintain a way of communicating with most people about, just how good is my home, A to G.
Okay, so I wanted to come on into the policy outcomes too. So that's the really ambitious target of by 2032, 80% of domestic buildings would have their heat supplied by low carbon technologies. So I've just used the example. So in my patch, which is in Edinburgh, there's a big housing development planned. I think it's something like 700 homes. It's a mixture of houses. There's apartments. There's going to be, obviously, a quarter of it will be affordable homes, possibly then managed by, the housing association. So I know that housing associations and local authorities can apply to this district heating's loan fund, which sounds like a really interesting idea. But I suppose my question is, if we want to get 80% of homes heated by low carbon technologies, I suppose this feeds into what you're saying, that maybe we need to start doing more now rather than waiting longer. So I suppose in a mixed tenure situation like that, but it would seem to me that district heating for the entire development would make sense, and yet only a couple of hundred homes in maybe one building could apply for the district heating loan fund. Do you think that, I mean, do you think we should be looking at maybe making new builds all have district heating? I mean, what do you think about that?
I'll go first. I think it only works once you've got a particular size of development. I think the economies of scale then are not so good. Recently we've heard from one major house builder that SEPA have stepped in and raised an objection to their development, despite them doing good fabric, they're planning to do for the development, solar, etc. And that's a sector that's been really badly hit by all the change in FITs, and that's a big SME sector. And again, I know it's outside the control of Scottish Government, but Jings, I mean, for the small SMEs who have been trying to train apprenticeships to install the micro MCS accreditation, that's been really hard for them to take, all these changes and fluctuations. But this particular house builder raised the issue that SEPA have actually written to them to say, we're going to write to object to your development because it's not putting in enough low carbon, it's not low carbon ambition enough. The builder's a bit taken aback by that. They've come to ask for advice to ourselves, and primarily because they're saying if we had known, if we knew the trajectory, we would have pre-planned. So I think coming back to, if we move it a district or community heating route, particularly a new build, then as long as we give enough time and warning that these are the intentions, then I think we'll have industry and the public on side. It does bring us to one other point, if I may. In here it does say that, sorry, before I get there, there's an article in, page 61, they talk about district heating and the take-up of loans. They do mention that the take-up of loans was lower than expected. I think it'd be very useful for everyone to know what was why did people not take up those district heating loans. There will be some evidence somewhere or some information. I'm sure that would be really useful, because this is a learning lesson for going forward. If we want to do more district community heating, we will need to know why the people didn't take up the loans when they were available. But in terms of new build, they mention here they're maybe in 2017 going to review the energy performance of new homes. Our strong recommendation is not to change the new build regulations for new housing. They're still bedding in the previous regulations from 2015. They're still bedding in silver, the level of sustainability for energy performance. Give the industry time. It is more bang for the buck to go after the retrofit and support that sector than change the new build. If you were going to change new build, link transport policy with new build, with sustainability, and encourage the new build homes to incorporate ULEV connecting points for electric vehicles. They're about £390 per home with a grant, and that would start the transformational shift. If people know they're buying a home, but it's already there, and they're employers with large car parks or public bodies with electrical charging points, then the home community is speaking to the business community of work or public sector work, and you've got an A to B transport and charging point.
Final point was about heating interventions made. So the idea that you've upgraded somebody's gas boiler, obviously that makes it much more efficient. But I suppose my question would be, what's the lifetime of these interventions, and will these things need to be replaced again with another technology in the future?
Pick up also on the previous question as well. In terms of the replacement cycle, that is something that should be considered as people are putting in new efficient gas boilers, have a lifetime of about 15 years. So if they're putting them in now, then we'd be in a good place to look at what is the low carbon alternative by the time that changes over. But that should also apply equally to support for extending the gas network. Should we really be doing that instead of putting people onto a low carbon alternative of a heat pump, or if you can have very efficient electric heating? So looking for alternatives and rather defaulting to what is already set out in this plan as what will be an outdated technology. On district heating, I think there is a consultation on heat mapping for requiring local authorities to do heat maps, and also for looking at regulation of district heating that would put in place some of the drivers that we were talking about that would require connection if it was appropriate. And that would support the taking forward of district heating. And that's something we very much support and would like to see more prominence given to that in the climate change plan. And lastly, on the new build regs, there is a proposal for looking at, in a sense, almost a Sullivan 3 of looking at building regulations for new build going forward, but it also has a remit for looking at existing homes. And I would argue that setting a trajectory for a new build, perhaps not, you know, there may be time to prepare, but putting in place that trajectory going forward is important. It's an important signal for the new build industry, and it provides for innovation for the existing home stock, but also for existing homes. There's routes to look at bringing in standards at point of major refurbishment, because after all, that is the most sensible time for you to undertake energy efficiency measures on the rest of your home when you're already having works done. And so that could be done through a building regulation process.
Okay. Thank you. Richard Leonard.
Yeah, I'm reminded in all this of the words of the pioneering socialist and ecologist William Morris, who said, "Hard it is for the old world to see the new." The world as it is that 80% of household gas heating is supplied by, it comes from gas. The world as it is that we're in the midst of a program of smart gas metering being installed. We're living in a world where gas replacement boilers are being installed up and down the country every day of the week. So I'm kind of struggling a little bit to understand how we'll get from the position to date of about 80% of heating supplies in households coming from gas to a position in just 15 years' time where 80% of heating supplied to households will come from low carbon technologies. I wonder whether somebody could help me understand the transition from the old world to the new.
I'm not sure that anyone actually understands that, and I think that's part of the problem. It's really unclear what that mix will look like out to 2032. Will the majority of people be on air source heat pumps? How many people will be connected to district heating? What proportion of households will still be heated by gas but with hydrogen injected? And it's not clear, but you're absolutely right. Arguably, you know, we're looking at 2-point-something million households having to have heating systems retrofitted. And if that is expected to happen in that really short time period between 2025 and 2032, what about someone that in 2025 has just installed a new gas boiler? That's going to have a lifetime of 12, 15 years, so that's beyond the 2032 time period. Are we going to be asking people to essentially replace a system that they have paid for before the end of its life? And I think there's lots of uncertainty there, and I'm not sure that anyone knows the knows the answer.
Presumably the author of the target knows the answer.
Well, even the author of the target suggests that that is more work that needs to be done in order to define.
I think Elizabeth Layton and then Professor Smith.
Well, I think the Times model knows the answer. So it's the modeling that is driving that forward as being cost effective. But I think I agree. It's difficult to get your head around it. But I suppose, you know, maybe you go back 20 years and, 20, 30 years when there was more the dash for gas. So the transition can happen given, the right drivers are put in place. And if it's seen as in the public interest, has that support, can happen. But I go back to what I was saying earlier, we should focus on what we do know we can do now. And that is dealing with the off gas, dealing with the electric, getting the district heating systems in. We can do that now. And by my estimates, that gets us, and Scottish Government estimates, that gets us to about 30%. We know, it's not 80%, but we know we can do that. And, let's focus on making sure that happens in the next, 5 to 10 years, as well as doing all this fabric improvements.
I would agree with that. I think particularly in some of the rural areas, this is where the opportunity should be taken. In small villages. For towns and cities, this change is stratospheric. Very, very difficult. The other issue is the incentive. If your current gas expenditure is a third of your electricity cost in terms of what you're paying, if gas is a third of electricity, then you might ask the question, why would I shift? Why do I want to shift to something which may be electric-based if it's 3 times the price? Now, prices change. There may be other incentives or other taxes, who knows? But yeah, very, very difficult. And let's not forget the pressures on the grid coming up in the next few years, electrification of cars, further electrification of the railway lines, various other measures. So the resources are not easy to fulfill that demand and need that will come.
In an earlier answer, Professor Smith, you referred to the importation of pipes from Russia to fix up district heating projects. And I think then you made a wider point about the supply chain. And I wondered whether you could perhaps develop that because we are the Economy, Jobs and Fair Work Committee, I wonder whether you could say something about the potential for job generation for the growth of the supply industries to some of these new low-carbon technologies.
I mean, certainly on the job side, if I can start off with the more negative side of things of what's coming in the next few years, because we have a really tough task for construction just now in the sector, and this, not just in Scotland, but across the UK. But giving you some Scottish figures, by 2021, 19,000 people will have left the jobs market of the construction sector in Scotland through retirement, various other means. We need to replace an annual recruitment requirement in Scotland of 4,000 people per year. The growth of South East Scotland and Edinburgh will require an additional 1,200 people to be trained per year for the next 5 years to meet the growth trajectories of the 28% growth in population that's happening in South East Scotland, particularly around Edinburgh. When you consider Brexit, 12% of the UK's construction workforce are EU workers. Scotland's about 9.6%, roughly about 1 in 10. But in London, 35 to 50% of EU workers are based on the house building sites. Now, we saw what happened in the 80s, we saw what happened in the 90s, that when London booms or they need the skills, there's a sort of migration internally in the UK of the workforce south to London. So taking everything else we have to do, the task alone of just getting enough skilled people to come in will be significant. And I think construction really needs further support from the government. I know they have put in for more modern apprenticeships and things, but as a sector, to build the hospitals, the care homes, the flats, the residential, the retrofit, it's a sector crying out for a lot more help to achieve this. In terms of jobs, for every new build home that we build, the jobs are 4.3 jobs for every home that gets built. Interestingly, the figures they show here are for every £100 million of investment in retrofit, it's 1,000 jobs. I think the figure is higher than that. I think they've done themselves down a bit in here in the statistics. They say Scottish Government analysis, but they don't reference the report, so I'd really like to see that, because our feeling is it's much higher than 1,000 jobs for 100 million investment. But going forward, yes, significant jobs. If you consider what we were talking about before for retrofit, if we do go after one home every minute for retrofit, that's a considerable amount of activity.
Thank you. Gordon MacDonald.
Thanks, Convener. Most of the questions I was going to ask have been covered by other members, but one thing I wasn't going to ask about was the service sector. And I'm noting that the service sector carbon envelope is expected to reduce by 96% over the next 16 years, the second most ambitious reduction after the electricity sector. And I'm just wondering how realistic that number was.
Realistic. It's certainly on the non-domestic sector, commercial and other things, the biggest gap we have now, actually, if we go forward with the carbon reductions, energy efficiency plans across all the building stock, the big gap just now is in the commercial and public sector areas. There's some great projects going on just now in Scotland to determine, more accurate, better solutions. City of Edinburgh Council is doing one just now where they're mapping all of their current building stock that they have non-residential to look at all the various solutions, but not the only ones. We know other local authorities have also been looking at various aspects of their building stock, but maybe I'd better to ask the local authority person to respond on that. But from the private sector, there's a huge amount of work required, because at least with housing, you've got a standardised approach. We have 170,000 four in a block. We have 240,000 tenements in Scotland. So we have a fantastic standardised approach that we could take. As soon as you go non-residential, as soon as you go into the commercial or public buildings, the stock variation, the building variation is quite bespoke across the country. So therefore, the remedial treatments, fabric, or other energy solutions required to reduce your carbon footprint become more complex.
And is there any easy intervention that can be put in place in order to push that everybody towards that target?
I don't have a full answer for that. No. I'll pass to other colleagues on that.
Well, I might be straying outside my existing homes brief, but in the Climate Change Act of 2009, there was an enabling powers to introduce regulation of the non-domestic buildings sector. And those were just introduced last year. And while that's good that they're there, but I would say they're quite weak, very light touch. And it's basically just requiring some assessment to be done, but not really much of a requirement to actually act on that action plan. And so I would hope that this climate change plan could require a review of what's been put in place, and that is strengthened as soon as possible, because for the non-domestic sector, it must be relatively easy to regulate. It may be a bit of a challenge to sometimes find the solutions, but I would think in many cases, some proper regulation brought in place would rather quickly bring up the standards.
Thank you, and Dean Lockhart.
Thank you. We've spoken quite a lot about policy and regulation, which has been very helpful, and you've covered a lot of the other questions I had. Can I turn now to technology and the role of technology in this area, and get your thoughts on the use of new technologies in energy efficiency and decarbonisation, and how the energy strategy can best incorporate the use of new technologies. Professor Smith, you spoke about smart meters and how they've resulted in a reduction in energy usage at key points. I understand there might be a possibility going forward you can actually monitor your energy consumption through your mobile phone, which I think would be a real step forward. What other changes might be coming down the pipeline in terms of new technologies? Because policy will obviously have to keep pace with new technologies.
Can I just add to what Sean was saying about smart meters? One thing that we are working on at the moment and really keen to do more of is to look at how we can link the advice that's provided through Home Energy Scotland to people's smart meter data, so we can provide much more personalised and specific advice to people based on their actual energy use and their actual energy use patterns, so we can spot what's happening and talk to people much more about what behaviours they might be using in the home and how they can control their heating better, etc.
Yes, on the point about technologies, my answer is going to be more about the use of technologies, like with smart meters, because after all, that's when we'll really realize the potential of how they can help us reduce energy. And I think much more needs to be provided, and I'd like to see it spelled out in the climate change plan in more detail, is support in terms of how people use energy in their homes. Because some of these technologies that come in, like using a smartphone to remotely manage your heating, fantastic. But there are a lot of people that just don't have a clue of how to do that, let alone how to use their heating controls in their home. And some of the pilot studies for the new energy efficiency program are looking at what kinds of support work best at first identifying what the needs are in terms of their energy use, what are the solutions, and then sort of aftercare program of making sure they know how to use the radiator controls. They know how to, they know about curtains, they know about, just the basics. And it's proving to make quite a significant difference. And it's really value for money, because they're not just getting the kit put in, but we're actually, seeing that performance gap addressed between what's predicted we're going to save to what actually happens and the person's experience.
some of the new technologies, we've been through various phases recently where industry, government, construction product suppliers have looked at different products. One of us in relation to a new type of thermal board, for example, which had, I think some people had great plans that for the older stock, particularly pre-1919, these thin type of boards would have been super efficient in terms of their performance. Both ourselves, Historic Scotland and others have looked at these boards and there are issues, particularly in the cost. But other issues in relation to their creep over time. That said, there's other things happening just now in terms of the Internet of Things, which has been touched on there. And there's some Scottish companies developing new softwares. We have tended to find that people are not too keen actually on the control side from their phones or wherever else. They're actually just more interested in the data and the information so they can see what's going on. So to that end, there's a number of companies in Scotland developing softwares which will help people understand how they're utilising things within their own homes or their car. And almost you become almost the energy person, wherever you're driving, doing, etc. Living is going to be part of what's in this piece of software. Developments in some of the electrical sectors such as OLED TVs. We remember seeing these about 8-9 years ago. Great to see them coming out, reducing the amount of energy that's going to be required. But it's also a learning curve because we've seen with the push some years ago on passive homes and passive direction, although it's a bit of a strange name because it's not passive, we use mechanical ventilated systems. I remember walking into a demonstrator house with a lot of government MSPs and civil servants and other people from different parties a few years ago into a passive or near passive house, and most people were pretty frightened by it. They didn't like the feel of it, the air didn't move. That said, you can still open windows, so there's a few myths. Of course you can open a window in passive. But we have to be careful because then if we drive up the temperature or energy performance of that building so much, and people are not ventilating and they don't understand how to live in a passive home, then you get black mold, damp, asthma, and various other things. With the mechanical ventilated heating that you require for passive type directions of energy standards, you also need to change the filters. Now, most people don't change the air filters above their cooker hoods, so we're going to require them to change the air filters for the mechanical ventilated heating system quite regularly. So there is a paradigm shift for people to understand how they use that home with the new technologies. I think the best steps that we've seen coming are in the fabric. Recently, Scottish house builders have built a series of sort of prototype and other homes which are now coming into the market. The average energy bill in Scotland is about £1,400 a year, dual fuel bill. These new homes are £300 a year or less. So the mechanisms are there through less sexy technologies, if we could put it that way, through the more standard approach with some of the fabric, and Scottish companies can deliver that, which is tremendous, and the architects are designing it. And the local authorities are very supportive because it's hitting the energy performance standard, it's not requiring too high tech.
I was just going to point out that perhaps we don't need to rely too much on new technologies. There's a lot of stuff already there that we're not doing particularly well yet anyway. And just on the behavioural change side of stuff, more on the non-domestic side, I must admit, but we've found that any intervention that we implement, it's best to target those that don't require the input of the user. That just takes the behaviour change issue out of the equation altogether. And so things like building fabric improvements that don't require people to know how to do things or require maintenance or any of these kind of longer term thoughts are preferable in my opinion. And you will always get those who pursue the technologies and want to have the latest kit and gear, and that's fine. But building fabric stuff, localized electricity, energy generation in general, local district heating networks, these things are already there. The technologies to support these things are already there. I don't think we need to worry too much about what's over the horizon.
Just on the building fabric side of things, I think it's really important to note that even when you improve a home's building fabric, often people inside the home don't know, for example, how to change their heating controls as a result of living in a warmer home, and they will just, for example, do things like open the window to start to control the heating. So just to come back to the point that even if we are just focusing on building fabric improvements, the people in the home are a really important part of that, and them knowing how to use the heating controls is really important if we are to get the carbon savings that we should be getting.
Just in relation to fabric, back in about 2007-8, we advised, as did others, that we should be putting 200 millimetres of insulation in lofts, because whilst we're there, not putting 100, we need to put in at least 200. Sadly, we didn't do that. Now it's interesting that one of the policies is that by 2032, I think they want to have 200 millimetres of insulation in the loft. So we're going to have to go back into a lot of these homes and put in that second layer. One point to note, just to the committee, on page 48, their 8.23, their first milestone, where they said by 2020, 60% of walls will be insulated. According to our stats, actually, they're already at 60% just now, depending on but as far as we've done, we've gone through these.
It's cavity and solid wall.
Yes, that's right. So previously, the page before, they cite that they're up to 71% for cavity and 11% for solid wall. When we take the figures for the solid and the cavity walls which are available, we have them at roughly 60% already just now. So I think that milestone, I think they've stated elsewhere, they see it as 57% at the moment for cavity, for external walls. I think it'd be nice to see that milestone lifted above 60. So it reflects as a real milestone.
And while we're speaking about milestones, Professor, 200 millimetres, is that about 8 inches for those who think in old measurements in terms of?
It is. The optimum depth is actually 270 millimetres, but 200 would be better than 100 at least.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, on that note, we'll close this section of this morning. I'll suspend the hearing to allow us to change witnesses. Thank you very much to all 4 of our witnesses for coming in today. And I'll also note that Jackie Bailey has intimated her apologies, the committee member who had expected to be here, but I'll just note that at this stage. Thank you very much. We'll recommence at 10 minutes to. Well, welcome back to everyone, and may I thank our witnesses for coming along for our second panel this morning. In no particular order, we have Gina Hanrahan, who is Climate and Energy Policy Officer, WWF UK, Professor Keith Bell, who is, I think, of Scottish Power, Professor of Smart Grids is what I have here. Perhaps you can correct my misdescription if that is what it is. Co-director of the UK Energy Research Centre at the University of Strathclyde, Dr. Mark Winskill, Research Fellow of the University of Edinburgh, and Gillian Herding, who is Access Project Manager of Community Energy Scotland. So welcome to all of you this morning. I'll start with a general question, and that is if each of you could give, perhaps very briefly, your key points and key concerns about the climate change plan and the energy strategy. So perhaps starting from left to right, Gillian Herding.
I think sort of echoing the points of my colleagues on the panel this morning, in general terms, we're obviously happy to see the continued support or the continued ambitions of the plan. And in relation to the strategy, the support that's maintained for community energy. I think obviously we see community energy as a fundamental sort of key driver in the transition that needs to happen in terms of changing consumer awareness, consumer behaviours as we move towards smart energy transitions. I suppose in terms of concerns around that, it's mainly perhaps less of a concern but more of a consideration around the role that communities are expected to play when they're taking forward these innovative projects. So previously we've seen communities really easily able to access funding for renewable energy systems through the feed-in tariffs and so on. And that was a really, a good way of communities engaging with the energy policy in a roundabout way. But now when we're sort of expecting more innovative solutions, innovative technologies, communities are really taking on a huge risk in the delivery of these projects. And I think that's not to say that there's not any sort of lack of motivation or ambition or even capability there, but I think it's maybe a concern around sharing that risk. The energy strategy sort of reflects on the fact that it expects some of these projects to fail because of their innovative nature, but I think it would be wise to consider the impacts of that on the local communities themselves, but what it means for taking further sort of smart energy projects forward in a similar way.
Thank you. Professor Bell.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm not of Scottish Power, by the way. I do speak as an independent academic, although they do sponsor the chair, just to put that on the record.
Yes, thank you for that clarification. My apologies if I got it wrong.
I think this is warmly to be welcomed, the energy strategy. I think as a responsible and civilised nation, I think it's absolutely right that we play our part towards the kind of global efforts towards decarbonisation, and of course we need to ensure reliability and affordability of energy. And I think it's right that that is expressed through some targets, and it's right that those targets are stretching. But it's also got to be realistic and ensure that they are achievable, albeit they are should be ambitious to some extent. I think another thing that's to be applauded is the attempt to consider the whole energy system, so not just electricity, not just heat, not just transport, but the whole thing together. And there's a lot of very difficult trade-offs to be evaluated in doing that. I can't honestly say that this is the final answer. I think what has been presented in the drafts, both the draft climate change plan and the draft energy strategy, should be seen as firstly as draft, but it's a really good starting point for discussion, for debate, and then for further analysis. I know that the Scottish Government have been working very hard to improve their modelling and analysis capability, and that's absolutely to be applauded again. But I think there is more to be done. It's a challenging thing. There are definitely uncertainties, both in terms of the modelling itself inherently, by the time you make the kinds of approximations you need to make to give some sense of whether all of this really is achievable and what seem to be the main kind of pathways. But also just in the kind of the data that goes in that, what the trends are likely to be in terms of relative technology costs, how, as you were talking about in the previous session, how energy users are going to engage with some of the different technologies or some of the different interventions. So yes, it's good that this has been published. It's good that there are ambitious targets. We need to explore, I think, the achievability and a bit more detail on the different pathways and on the implementation further. And of course, in that, the Scottish Government is one among a whole number of really important stakeholders. UK Government, of course, is very important. To date, the EU has been very important. We have to see how that pans out. And of course, industry and individual consumers are very important in all of this as well.
WWF would strongly welcome the 50% target that was set for renewable energy by 2030 in the energy strategy. I think that's a target that's both credible and achievable, something we've been calling for a long time together with a whole range of different stakeholders and industry. So that's a very, very welcome step forward, and it gives confidence about the direction of travel now. On the climate change plan more broadly, I suppose we are overall disappointed at the level of policy detail that's included in it. It used to be called the Report on Policies and Proposals. It's got a snazzier title now, but ultimately what this is supposed to do is give a clear indication of all the policies and proposals that are going to deliver the targets that have been set out from the Times model. And we don't have confidence that there's enough in there that the carbon envelopes will be delivered. The Committee on Climate Change has repeatedly said that more policy effort needs to happen if we're going to deliver on existing targets, let alone future targets. But I think there are three areas that are within the remit of this committee that it's worth focusing on as deficient. The first is on energy efficiency. We heard a lot this morning about how the approach is pretty much business as usual, and that's despite the very, very welcome commitment to make energy efficiency a national infrastructure priority. But if we're going to be strong about that and maximise the benefits of making that an infrastructure priority and bringing all homes up to a really good standard, we need to move much faster than the plan indicates. We need to fund it, and we need to make clear how we're going to deliver on it, and I don't think there's enough detail there. On heat, I think there's a very stretching policy outcome in both the residential and services sectors for almost complete decarbonisation, 80% in homes and I think 94% in the non-domestic sector. But there's very little detail about how that's actually going to be delivered and what it looks like in terms of technology mix. There's a proposal in there that backloads effort to the late 2020s, starting from 2025. I think there's an issue around credibility there in terms of policy. And on electricity, I think overall the plan is, the energy strategy and the climate change plan are good. They're welcome steps forward. It's good to see an acknowledgement that we're going to have a near decarbonised system by 2020. But I would question the reliance on CCS for negative emissions from the mid-2020s. And I think that might come to pass, but we shouldn't build it in as our plan A. So.
Yes, hello. I agree with most of what's been said so far. I think there are some issues about, just at the very high level, in terms of the way the two documents look together. And also the kind of process for consultation. So we've been working, Keith is a UK Energy Research Centre colleague of mine, and I also work for Climate Exchange, which is the Scottish Government National Centre for Expertise on Climate Change and Energy Policy. So we've been working reasonably closely with the Scottish Government in helping sort of provide advice for the energy strategy and the plan. I think overall, you know, it's already been said by everybody that we welcome the ambition. Climate science is ever more kind of confident about the urgency and scale of the challenge globally, and how that cascades down to Europe and to nations. So that's all welcome. We've got raised ambition in the climate change plan. The overall carbon envelope is raised as related to the most recent advice from the Committee on Climate Change, so that again seems appropriate. I think that one of the problems we have is the amount of detail that we're seeing in both documents is lacking in terms of how we can go about engaging and kind of offering advice on alternative pathways and technology portfolios, levels of demand, assumed demand, and so on. So, you know, we have a single pathway in the climate change plan, which is appropriate because there has to be a single advice to government, but there isn't any attempt to look at alternative pathways and to systematically go through, you know, what if CCS doesn't appear and things like that, what if demand can be reduced more rapidly than perhaps is assumed in the single climate change plan. So there's a problem, I think, there, but there's then looking at the energy strategy, which is the sort of the companion piece. Again, we don't see any alternative integrated pathways which would allow us to sort of systematically interrogate the kind of assumptions about overall system cost, relative demand, relative efforts on supply and demand. There was some interesting discussion just at the end of the last panel about, the technology is already there. We don't need to think about radical technologies. We can just use the technologies that already exist. And we don't, there was a suggestion that we can avoid a lot of behavioral change if, the smart thing is just to avoid disruptive behavioral change. So all those kind of issues need really interrogating and thinking through systematically. What if, these technologies don't appear? So I think that, there's a bit of a problem about how we engage from now on in the consultation period. I know the Scottish Government's intention is to make this information available over time, but it isn't there at the moment.
Right, thank you very much. We'll start with a question from Dean Lockhart.
Sorry, can I come in a bit later?
Yes, certainly. Do we have a question from Andy Whiteman?
Thank you, Convener. Thanks for those opening remarks. Could I just, there's a number of things to pick up on, but first of all, it's not entirely clear to me. The overall target is set, that's clear, but it's not entirely clear why the individual sector envelopes have been set at the level they have been. And I'm not entirely clear as to the constraints that were placed on the model to get the pathway that we've got. I've asked the Scottish Government about this, and they say that they would, do as much as they can to provide greater transparency, but I'm still not clear. Are any of you clear why the different sectors have got the targets they've got?
No. Simple answer. I think there's two potential ways of looking at this. One is to say, well, come on, give us the detail. You've done all this modelling. You're producing a strategy. It's receiving a lot of attention, quite rightly, a lot of discussion, not just us, but lots of other people, lots of investors looking at it. Surely you can give us some more information and some more detail and more of the sensitivity analysis around it. Absolutely, I would totally agree with that. On the other hand, my understanding is that they're really just kind of building up this modelling capability. Now, maybe they should have invested more time and resource into it, because it does have such an influence on the way the strategy is perceived and the way in which the different sectors are going to respond to it and see it as a potentially the right or a good pathway to follow. So I think I would certainly encourage greater investment of time and effort on the part of the Scottish Government and advisors working with them to produce exactly that kind of analysis and the kind of the detail. Because as Mark said, there's a lot of uncertainty around precisely what pathways. This is only one among a number of potential pathways, and the assumptions that have gone into that are not clear. And I think Gina mentioned, about sort of the heat decarbonisation, for example. There are things in some of the charts which are produced in the documents that do look like modelling artifacts, rather than necessarily kind of reflections of a real world as we might expect to see it. But you've got to start somewhere, I think, and so there's basically more work to be done, and let's encourage the officials and their advisors to get on with that.
Yeah, sorry, Gina. Well, I do agree with that. I mean, I think the Scottish Government have already said that and there is a process by which the modelling results have been fed back to the policy teams and then to the Cabinet Subcommittee for sign-off and so on. So I think the modelling is almost a starting point for a systematic kind of look at energy and climate policy. And it's a particular tool. So there are other ways of doing. The RPP2 process was very different. It was a bottom-up, sector-by-sector approach, which had a lot more detail actually in some of the policy domains than we've got in the climate strategy. So there are advantages to the way this has been done with the Times model. And I think, we in the UK Energy Research Centre, we've spent a lot of time using the same tools. But we've learned as well that the system models are kind of give you a partial insight, and there's an awful lot of off-model knowledge that has to go into any kind of properly integrated strategy. I think one of the issues is that we don't have, yeah, I mean, this business of sector envelopes. So if you look at the Committee on Climate Change's advice on the same pathway, so the Committee on Climate Change published pathway analysis in March last year for Scotland based on the same period, 28 to 2032. And if you compare the sector carbon envelopes that the CCC came up with compared to the CC plan, they do look quite different. So, for example, there's a much less emphasis on building sector emissions, domestic and non-domestic, out to 2032 in the CCC work than you find in the CC plan. There's much more emphasis on transport sector emission reductions in the CCC work. So the CCC didn't use a system model, they did bottom-up analysis, akin, I suppose, to RPP2. There was some modelling work commissioned, but they didn't use the Times model. So the CCC haven't had use of the Times model, I don't think, the Scottish Times model. So it does beg the question, why you know, this pattern of sectoral carbon envelopes, and what kind of sensitivities have been looked at. You know, I think that work has been done within government. I know, you know, the government gave evidence to the Environment Committee last week, and they said they've looked at different scenarios. They looked at what if we don't get CCS on the system. So that has been looked at. That's been costed, and you know, you can imagine there's what we're seeing is a version of a least cost pathway, but I think we're lacking enough kind of data and evidence on the assumptions and things that we can really kind of help, you know, in terms of the consultation process from now on. I think, given we've only got a few months to do this, I think it would have been helpful to make that a bit more systematically evident, you know, so we can really get to work on the assumptions and the data.
Okay, thanks. Very helpful. I mean, I note, for example, the...
And come in on that, I think, and then you can
briefly add to that and echo the points that have been made already. Just to clarify, I think that two of the sectors that are going to be the biggest emitting sectors in the 2030s, so agriculture and transport, were inputs to Times rather than outputs of Times. Is that correct? Close to that, anyway.
The assumptions were done elsewhere.
The assumptions were built outside the Times model, so that's important to note. I think transparency is key here, and I think we do need to understand particularly what political constraints were imposed on Times and how far what we see in the climate change plan is from the original run of Times. So that, I think, understanding the various iterations of it is very important. I mean, this goes particularly hard on heat, for instance. Does that then let other sectors off the hook when there might be actually huge progress that can be made much faster, for instance, in transport? We're less ambitious there than we are on heat. So I think understanding Times and why it's done what it's done is crucial.
Thank you. Gillian Herding, perhaps, and then...
It's a very general point, I suppose. I think it's just to not... With those considerations, and I take Keith's point about having to start somewhere, with the modelling and these sort of sectoral envelopes, I think it's important just to maintain that acknowledgement that we're going, if, you know, we're transitioning to the smart energy systems, then there will be sharing of this generation and demand. There will be sharing of these, CO2 outputs that will need to be encompassed into whatever is taken forward. I mean, I don't know how that modelling would look if we're not sure how the existing modelling already exists, but I think it's important to bear that in mind that, yeah, the smart energy transition will involve sectors sort of operating in that way.
Andy Whiteman, I think you wanted to come
Just two brief supplementaries. What evidence do you have, Gina, that assumptions around were built outside the Times model? I mean, if they were, I'd like to know what those assumptions were. Obviously, you may not be privy to them, but what evidence do you have that they were actually built? And the second point is in relationship to your WWF's recommendation that there shouldn't be an assumption in favour of negative emissions for electricity by 2032. But if CCS is a technology that works, then presumably CCS should do as much as it can. So is underpinning that recommendation the fact that you don't think CCS should be given the status that it has in the plan, or what?
So to deal with the first question on agriculture and transport, I'm not privy to the full workings of Times, but that's my understanding based on conversations with the modellers, and I'm sure the Scottish Government could provide you with much more detail on that. On the CCS point, there might be an important role for carbon capture and storage globally, particularly in the industrial sector long term. A lot of people do see it as an important part of the decarbonisation pathway. We have done a number of pieces of research over the last number of years. So WWF, in conjunction with Friends of the Earth Scotland and RSPB Scotland, commissioned work by Ricardo Energy and Environment, which looked at Scottish electricity system and indeed renewable energy more generally. And it showed that we don't need to have CCS to decarbonise electricity in Scotland and deliver security of supply by 2030, so that we can maximise our renewable energy resources and have an effectively wholly decarbonised system without CCS. So we don't need it for electricity here, though it may have an important role to play in decarbonising industry long term. I guess what we're just questioning is the credibility of relying on it to deliver, I think it's minus 1.1 megatons by 2032. That's a significant amount of emissions. If that doesn't come to pass, where do we flex in other sectors to deliver more? So we just don't see it as part of Plan A for this climate change plan, particularly in electricity.
Well, if I could maybe add to that, I think I would echo what Gina was saying about the risk associated with, apparently relying on a particular technology, but that isn't what a strategy should be setting out, is a reliance on any particular technology. It should be setting out shorter-term policy interventions that enable the longer-term outcome, even if the particular pathway by which we reach that longer-term outcome is still to a large extent to be determined. So that means you kind of go for the low regrets type of actions in the short term to keep different options open that seem to have some potential for the longer term, and that would seem to me to include CCS. Where the potential benefits of it, if it does come to pass in the kind of cost regions that people are talking about, would be very large. And as you say, if you've got it and it works and it's cost effective, then use it. Of course, we don't know what the costs are really going to be. So it's not my area. It's not something I feel confident speaking about. And I know you've got a session next week where you'll be hearing about that. Where you'll be hearing from a geologist, for example, who can tell you a lot about the storage aspects of it. But I would encourage you to talk to a chemical engineer who can talk about the other aspects of it to get an idea as to whether the kind of cost assumptions that are typically used by energy economists are really robust.
Dr. Winscoe.
Yes. I just wanted to come back on Andy's point about to what extent the assumptions on things like transport have been made out with the model, and that is specified in the annex. So there's a Times model annex at the back of the CC plan, which makes clear that the carbon envelope for transport was developed through some consultancy research and through Transport Scotland. For the residential sector, they used the national housing model. It's interesting that for demand, this isn't the version of the model that's been used isn't elastic demand. So that means that the levels of demand are being inputted into the model rather than sort of allowed to develop within the model. So I think if we're thinking about the overall approach and whether there's enough emphasis on demand reduction, it'd be interesting to know why we have those kind of levels of assumed demand. The demand reduction levels look quite modest to me in the heat sector. So I'd like to understand those a bit more. That seems to have been based on external assumptions. So I think we need, that would be one of the key areas for me.
I think Gina Hanrahan want to come back briefly on this, and then we'll move to a question from Bill Bowman.
Convener, just briefly on the issue of negative emissions, the energy strategy seems to indicate that a lot of that will be delivered through bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And we don't have enough detail on that. I think the strategy commits to a bioenergy action plan or strategy to come forward in the next year or so. But that raises sustainability concerns around where that source of bioenergy is coming from. We just don't know enough at this stage to say whether that's A, credible, and B, sustainable.
Bill Bowman.
Convener, just like to go back to something Gillian Herding said earlier. talking about community energy being key, and that some projects, I think you said, were being inhibited by risks that were being passed to them. Was that financial risks or other risks, and how would you suggest these are dealt with?
I think, yes, so my general point was around the sort of move to expecting, so community energy is sort of driving that innovation, it is at the forefront of that innovation, and I think it's a real achievement of Scottish communities, and obviously with the financial support that the Scottish Government has provided through various schemes, that we're at that stage. I think now, and sort of given the regulatory constraints or the political constraints that perhaps Westminster are more inclined to impose on these sorts of projects, or the impact on these projects. There's a risk for communities if these projects do fail, what it means for them sort of as individuals, often voluntary-based organisations, to then take forward additional projects, but also what that means to within their local community, but what that means for other sort of similar smart grid projects going forward. But I think in terms of risk sharing, I mean, it's really sort of, you know, these projects involve a lot of sort of very broad stakeholder partnerships, so communities working with organisations like energy suppliers, with DNOs or DSOs, and that's, you know, conversations that they might not normally be involved with. So this isn't sounding like just a plug, but organisations like intermediaries like Community Energy Scotland working sort of to sort of navigate that path with them, I think is helpful. But I think sort of, you know, more basic things like extending delivery times for those sorts of projects, maybe from 3 to 5 years, and acknowledging the timescales that it takes to go from, you know, conceptual ideas to full-scale delivery and implementation would be helpful as well. And I think sort of, yeah, help with the financial risk of those projects would be beneficial as well. You know, with the removal of the feed-in tariffs and so on, it's proving more difficult for communities to get financial support, so loans and so on. So it is very difficult for them to muster the capital investment up front.
So you think they need more advice, or they need some form of legal protection?
I think there's definitely an acknowledgement of the complexity of these projects, and as they move to sort of more demand-side management-based projects, you know, there's communities that are working with energy suppliers to provide heating services, for example. So if you're looking at that model, yes, we're working within you know, the projects that I personally manage, we're working with the legalities of the energy supplier that is in the project partnership. But I think, yes, having some sort of general advice that's consistent to these types of innovation projects would be helpful.
Brief follow-up from Gillian Martin.
Mr. Bowman's question, can you be more specific about the types of projects where you have seen a risk been taken where there has been failure? Can you give me an example of where that's happened and why that's happened? Well, you're talking about communities who've invested in a project where that actually hasn't worked out for them as a result of maybe a change in policy, or tariffs been imposed, or any kind of subsidies been withdrawn. Can you give me an example of where that's happened? And
Yeah, no, so sorry, I should confirm. So these projects haven't failed, or there's not sort of particular projects that I'm referencing at the moment. I think just within the energy strategy, it acknowledges that some of these projects might fail, and you know, and that leads to the point that they will include the learning from those projects as well, so we can sort of take that forward. But I think it's within that context. So for example, when we put bids together for these types of projects, allowing sort of scope, so allowing funds to go towards the operational cost, to like a very comprehensive risk assessment and that sort of thing. So I'm talking preventatively rather than based on something that's happened.
Thanks.
Thank you. Ash Denham.
Certainly, as I was reading through the documents, I was really interested to see the proposal for the creation of the government-owned energy company, and that it might be potentially funded by selling Scottish renewable energy bonds. I'm interested in the views of the panel on that, what sort of impact they think it might have, and whether they think it is something the government should be pursuing.
Yeah, I think sort of speaking generally, I think anything that sort of extends the funding mechanisms that communities can access, that consumers can access, is helpful. So I suppose, yeah, the option of a government-owned energy company offers a little bit more longevity in that sense. And yeah, in terms of the renewable ones, I think that there would, you know, that would be a positive step forward. I think it allows individuals or communities who might not necessarily own their own properties, own space to buy into renewable energy, and I think it is a very positive option.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the legalities are of the state getting involved at whatever level, but the idea of a bond has some attractions, yeah.
Just to add on the proposal around the government kind of having extensive power purchase agreements as well, I thought was interesting as a way of alternative support for onshore wind. It's kind of raised and hinted at in the document, not fully fleshed out. The government already has a contract to procure 100% renewable energy, is my understanding. But this would be a more direct way of supporting onshore, and I think that that is also very welcome.
I mean, so the strategy, the climate change plan pathway depends on at least a doubling and I think a trebling on onshore wind to 2032. So how is that going to happen? We know the UK government is unlikely, the current government is unlikely to offer any more support for onshore wind. So this is a sort of necessary consequence of that pathway, I suppose. I think we're lacking details about the government-owned energy company and exactly what the sort of, you know, the risks and liabilities as well as the advantages are of doing that. You know, ultimately the government then becomes the risk manager, the risk taker, rather than private companies and so on. So I think that needs a closer look at. Yeah.
I think that kind of unpicks one of the kind of key issues around the whole of well, energy strategy at a UK level and a Scotland level, a European level of the last few years, about the management of risk and uncertainty. So up till now, certainly renewable electricity seems to be the most cost-effective way of trying to kind of get some decarbonisation of energy use. But the technologies have had some uncertainties associated with them. There have been costs where they've been higher than the kind of fossil fuel-based alternatives. But largely as a result of policies that have been put in place, those costs have come down. And so I think it is realistic to talk about subsidy-free onshore wind or solar PV or whatever in the right kind of circumstances. And then the trick comes, well, all right, well, how do you still enable the investment in these kinds of things to take place? UK government has not been afraid, actually, of intervening and it has therefore, in other words, not left it entirely to the market. So the capacity market that you would have heard about in the news this last couple of days, in which the auction is taking place and then bids should be submitted in the next few days, is one example. The contracts for difference auctions are another example. So the central procurement of certain volumes with guaranteed prices is a way of de-risking and of facilitating the investment. So in a way, that kind of step has already been taken, which means, I think, that the kind of idea of a subsidy-free central procurement, it's, that point has already been acknowledged to an extent, So it's less about what the subsidy is, in inverted commas, than about how to actually facilitate the investment. And in a way that, and as Mark says, who's picking up risks associated with that? There are still uncertainties, as we mentioned already, about the whole energy system and what's the most cost-effective way of decarbonising it, and what we commit to in the short to medium term. In the longer term, if you're going to commit to anything like this, and to enable the investment, a longer-term contract seems to be necessary, and we hear that all the time in terms of flexible demand or about electricity generation capacity or whatever it happens to be. So longer-term contracts seem to be reasonable, but then there's always a risk that you might have some stranded assets then, or you commit yourself to a contract that, with the benefit of hindsight, turns out not to have been quite the cheapest way of doing it. Who bears that kind of risk? Well, arguably that's the sort of risk that you socialise, because the whole kind of decarbonisation, reliability and affordability agenda suggests that it should be socialised. So I think we need to get into the detail of how we do that and how you meet the costs of it. In other words, what split of the bill goes where, and that's absolutely the right thing for policymakers to talk about. And an example of that is the renewables financial mechanisms to date have been imposed on bill payers, so your part of the total cost is proportional to how much energy you use. And we do hear people saying, well, maybe it should be on a basis of tax. That's a perfectly valid debate to take place, and it's the sort of thing that I would look to the likes of you to engage with as part of our political representation.
Yeah, because I suppose it does seem to me that if you have a government-owned energy company and if it was capitalised appropriately, that they could take more risk, perhaps, in getting in earlier with technologies that maybe the market may not support. I suppose I'm thinking here about Wave, where we've obviously seen problems in getting that off the ground for lack of investment from the market. So it seems, although you've said we don't maybe need to pursue new technologies as such because we have technologies that could work, but it seems to me that there might be opportunities there if we have different modes of investment maybe.
Different modes of investment already. So Wave is a long way off, by the way. I think, and just because we've got some technologies that do seem to be, well, I might talk about grid parity in terms of overall cost, doesn't mean that there isn't a need for innovation. And clearly there's enormous potential offshore for the harvesting of energy. Unfortunately, it's the same energy that tends to break the machinery. But, so there's issues there. But the kind of mechanism you put on that, because it's still quite low technology readiness level, would be a different mechanism with a different perception of risk, let's say. I think the system as a whole still is one of those big issues to be addressed, not just about what the right pathway is, and we've talked about that already, but just if you limit it to electricity, which is my specialism, 100% renewable electricity system is highly challenging. Now, if you happen to have the right kind of geographical resources that you can have lots of hydro in that, then yeah, it's great, fantastic, go for it. You've got lots of that flexibility. One of the massive challenges is the huge disparity between the demand for heating in winter and the demand for heating in summer, and so the total energy doesn't tell you the whole story. We have to actually look at the time dimension of it as well, and then the spatial dimension, because you've got to get the energy from one place to another, and therein lie, I think, the need for further innovation, further research to finally get the reliability that we want at least cost while staying within a particular carbon trajectory.
One final short question. If we're looking ahead and we're seeing more electricity demand, so I'm thinking electrification of maybe some further rail lines, I'm thinking about people who might be placing orders for electric cars, which that could take off if we're trying to decarbonise heating for domestic and non-domestic and people are switching to electricity for that. Do you think the assumptions that have been made about the demand looking into the future are about right?
I think the kind of whole energy system model that we've been talking about and criticising a little bit, but it's a good way of informing the debate, starts from energy services rather than necessarily it's a particular number of megawatt hours of electricity, a particular number of megawatt hours of gas or hydrogen or whatever it happens to be. So yes, there are some uncertainties about the energy service demand, and that's the point I think that Mark made about the inelasticity of it. These sorts of models tend to take the energy service demand as a given. So clearly there are feedbacks that go on within society and within the economy that isn't actually completely the right answer. So there is a need for a more sophisticated modelling that kind of iterates with other sorts of models. In principle, if you believe the way that Times is set up, then it optimizes quite how you meet that heat need, whether through electricity or through burning hydrogen or whatever it happens to be. And as we said earlier, that's where some of the uncertainties are, because we're not actually totally sure about some of the relative costs. We're not sure about the deliverability in terms of the whole supply chain, for example. But at least it gives us a set of potential pathways that allow us to dig in more detail and test the assumptions. I see the value of something like Times modelling as not being in terms of answering questions, but in helping us to know the next questions to ask.
Dr. Winston. I'll answer this question on demand specifically, but there was another point about sort of risk that I wanted to make, but I'll try and work in as well. So on demand, so looking at this sector by sector, for electricity, we're getting pretty close to the 100% target. So for the future growth of low carbon electricity is based on assumptions of export, predominantly to RUK, which makes a lot of sense at the RUK, at the GB and UK Times level. That's all kind of consistent economic least cost approaches to decarbonisation. For the other sectors, I would say this is, again, in the absence of a lot of evidence published in the plan, it seems to me that the demand reductions for residential and non-domestic buildings are very modest. So if I've got this right, it suggests a 6% reduction in residential heat demand by 2032 and 10% for the non-domestic sector. Now, we've already seen quite dramatic changes in heat demand, residential and non-residential, over the last 10 years. It's partly because prices have been doubling for heat, but there's also a suspicion that this is partly about efficiency measures and so on. So I think the prospect of going further on heat demand reduction isn't sufficiently recognised in the plan as it stands. That's important not only because it's the least cost way of doing the job of decarbonisation, but it also makes the business case for heat supply infrastructure investments. It changes the economics of that. So if there's less demand to service, the case for building loads of new heat infrastructure, whatever it is, electrical or heat networks, or even gas grid repurposing, that all becomes weakened. There's less demand out there. So we need to get demand right. And I think that's where the whole system strategy should start with a serious look at demand levels, what can be managed out of the system and what's realistic. Without expecting this to be a silver bullet, and we've got the problem of rebound effects, but we know that demand reduction is already happening in heat. It's pretty dramatic. The other point I just wanted to make about risk is that because we've got a very ambitious overall carbon envelope here to 2032, and because the carbon envelopes are concentrated on heat and electricity particularly, the trajectories are now significantly ahead of where the UK sees itself in the heat sector and the power sector. So we're waiting for the UK government's carbon emissions reduction plan, which is due, I understand, in March. But already the evidence is here that Scotland is embarking, for example, on a heat transition at least 5 years ahead of where the UK government and the latest kind of discussions from the department see the heat sort of transition. So the implications of that are, there might be some advantages in doing that, getting ahead of building your supply chain up. I'm sure that's, there are advantages in a transition. But if Scotland is going ahead on heat ahead of the UK, are we able to socialise the costs of that infrastructure around the whole of the UK? There's an issue there. It also means that the sort of power sector trajectory is seeing the earlier introduction of CCS than the UK government envisages at the moment. I don't think that's going to change. We haven't heard much by way of the UK government published an industrial strategy which notably avoided saying anything about CCS. It talked about lots of other things like e-vehicles and smart power. It didn't say anything about CCS. So I don't think we're going to see a kind of turnaround in the near term on CCS. I think we do need to try and support CCS at the UK level. But it does mean that the Scottish trajectory on power and heat is exposed to a lack of effort at the UK level. So quite how that's going to, the financial implications of that, if we're just socialising around the Scottish economy rather than the UK economy, I think that really needs thinking through in terms of the macroeconomic kind of consequences.
Just to echo the points that have been made, I fully agree that the ambitions on demand reduction do seem modest. I was here for the previous session where one of your witnesses held up that very interesting graph looking at the projections from RPP 1 and 2 versus the current plan, and it looks less ambitious, followed by a very ambitious fall off from 2025, but much less ambitious previously. I think managing the electrification of heat and transport requires us to really think very hard about how we can excuse me, improve the fabric of our homes as much as we can, as quickly as we can, so that we're not wasting that heat in the first place, or so that the demand for heat is reduced in the first place. And in that respect, we think that the plan broadly doesn't go far enough. There's still 1.5 million homes below a C standard in Scotland, so a lot more can be done and a lot faster. Transport we haven't talked about much, but the plan is broadly reliant on electrification. It primarily focuses on technological change in the transport sector. That looks like a clear policy decision, but modal shift and promoting modal shift, whether that's to active travel, whether that's to public transport, whether that's freight consolidation in other areas, that is a critical component of ensuring that the demand on the electricity system is manageable going forward. And just on the issue of heat pumps, our report that I mentioned earlier by Ricardo Energy and Environment introduced, the vast bulk of the heat pumps that it introduced were hybrid heat pumps, so hybrid electric and gas, to reduce the peakiness on the system at certain times. So that's a possibility. That could be a technology that will form part of the mix. The CCC has said it could be a transitional technology, but there are other ways of managing this demand, and getting the demand down in the first place is what we need to concentrate on.
Thank you. Gillian Herding wanted to come in, and then a brief follow-up from Gordon MacDonald.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly add to that. I think, you know, we have focused on the risk associated with being more innovative and so on, and I just think it's important to also note that the role that community energy or these types of projects actually playing, you know, aside from the local energy economy benefits that are associated with them, but just in terms of communicating these really sort of quite complex technical systems and so on. I think in that sense it's a real, you know, it would be really vital to focus on the positive aspects of community energy as well, and sort of moving towards these demand reductions that we need to see from various sectors, how those are normalised, how those are socialised through peer-to-peer learning and so on, which comes about from, you know, the actual practical on-the-ground solutions that people can see in their neighbourhoods or in their local areas. And you know, previously we focused on sort of the Highlands and Islands, or a lot of these projects are within the Highlands and Islands or in rural communities. But as we sort of move into sort of more local projects, so Tower Power project in Edinburgh, for example, where we're sort of approaching people who wouldn't maybe traditionally be involved in these types of projects, or people that we have sort of a social obligation to reach out to, we can sort of, you know, transfer that message into much more broader areas of influence as well.
To move, to go back to the point that Mark Winskill raised about the UK government and how Scotland's 5 years ahead, and the impact that the UK government could have on the climate change plan and the targets we achieve. I'm thinking of the evidence from the existing Homes Alliance that says in order to go to a low carbon heat technology, it says it relies on the UK government to make decisions on the long-term future of the gas network. In terms of transport, emission standards and excise duty are very much still a reserved matter for the UK government, and in industry, it's the UK government that's looking at climate change agreements and climate change levies. So I'm just wondering, what's the role of the UK government in this plan, and are they acting as a brake rather than supporting it moving forward, given that 5-year difference?
We just don't really know how much ambition is going to be built into what we see in the carbon emission reduction plan. I think that's absolutely critical to the feasibility of what we're seeing in the Scottish Climate Change Plan. I mean, I probably know most about heat because I've been looking at that for a couple of years now, and the heat sectors, I mean, I would agree with what was said there by the existing Homes Alliance, that the heat problem has become the kind of focus of attention for the UK government as well as the Scottish government. This is not just a Scottish government concern, but the evidence on heat and the you know, what is the most affordable decarbonisation approach for heat has really been difficult to kind of pin down. So we've moved away from thinking electrification is the way to do it towards an interest in district heating. And then in the last sort of, just the last sort of 2 years really, the idea of using hydrogen in the existing gas mains and the distribution network, that's really come back into policy interest. So, and I know that the Scottish Government are really looking at that as well. There's some suggestion that that's built into a modest amount, that's already built into the climate change plan pathway. And then I think the government are looking at a much greater take-up of hydrogen for heating in the energy strategy out to 2050. So I think the problem is what we have in the plan is a very, so it's what Gina said, that there's not much happening in terms of getting the deployment of these technologies up to about 2027, And then we've got 7 years of very rapid change in the climate change plan. So we've got almost a wholesale transformation of the Scottish building stock within a 7-year period. Now, that is remarkable. It's akin to, I was looking at the penetration rates when we went from town mains gas to natural gas for heating. And it's as quick or about the same speed of transformation. And that was using an existing pipeline. There was a backbone pipeline already in place that they built for the liquid natural gas that they could convert for the, so that wasn't totally new infrastructure. So, and the fact that Scotland is intending to do this sort of ahead of UK government, so it's doing, you know, quite a radical transformation. It doesn't say exactly how much district heating, how much heat pump, how much hydrogen we're seeing there, but either way, you know, all three are quite disruptive and quite costly. There isn't an obvious winner amongst those three at the moment in the evidence, so, and to compress that all into 7 years. So, the question is, I'm not saying that's, you know, beyond belief, but what happens before that? So what are we doing for the decade from now to 2027 in preparation to make that, presumably, you know, as Keith says, some of this can be associated with just the way the model optimizes, that it concentrates effort at certain times and you get these breakpoints in the trajectories, which isn't quite how things tend to happen in sort of the real world. But it means that over those 10 years, we've got sort of 10 years preparation time on heat. There has to be a lot of work on demonstrating these technologies at sufficient scale to make sensible kind of business plans for the mass rollout of these technologies. So we need you know, a proper demonstrator on this idea of hydrogen. There's a lot of speculation. There's a lot of different people saying different things about this. I think we need understanding the appropriate role for district heating. We need some proper scale pilots. I know SEEP is intending to look at supply as well as demand, but I think demand is more of an obvious area for rollout than supply at the moment, where the evidence is still missing. So, you know, I think there are real risks here, and we need a sort of we need more detail about if the, you know, I think some of this, once we've seen what the UK government intends to do, we can say how exposed is Scotland really going to be in some of these areas.
Gil Patterson with a brief supplementary, and then we'll move on to John Mason.
Convener. It was something from this morning's earlier on session, and Gina Hanrahan has mentioned something about it, but maybe could go a bit further. The question was raised, and we talked extensively about heat loss and retrofitting and in the private sector, public sector, and although we are doing reasonably well when it comes to the public sector, when it comes to the private sector, both within industry, business, and in a domestic situation, then it's very difficult. So my question to you would be, what would you see that we should do in order to encourage them? Is it the stick or is it the carrot? Or is it regulation that we need?
So I think the answer on that is a bit of everything. So this, the SEEP programme, which is supposed to deliver this massive retrofit of all commercial and domestic homes over a 15 to 20 year period, it should be designed to with a mix of measures, and that's the intention. So there'll be a mixture of incentives, regulation for the private rented sector, regulation long-term for the owner-occupied sector, which includes commercial buildings, potentially a range of different financial incentives. We can use the capital budget. So it's a whole mix of different approaches. There's a consultation out on SEEP at the moment, and the SEEP programme has been in development now for about 18 months, is my understanding. The commitment to a national infrastructure priority was made in 2015. And what we don't have in that consultation is enough detail on the government's preferred scenario now for SEEP, what the balance is between those measures and how much money is going to be put up, exactly when regulation is going to come in. And I think seeking clarity on that from the government would be very useful if the plans for emissions reductions in the residential and services sector are to be fully credible.
Thanks for that. Thank you.
Did someone else want to just make a brief point on that as well, or?
One more thing to it, if I may. The sleep consultation sets out the intention to introduce regulation for the owner-occupied sector as well, long-term. These are proposals, the regulatory proposals were contained in previous RPPs. So we haven't seen a massive development of policy on the regulatory aspect. There was a commitment to do this for a long time, and a working group was set up to look at regulation of the private sector as a whole. In the last Parliament, it was known as the REAPS working group. Some of you may have been familiar with its workings, and it came close to producing consultation for regulation of all owner-occupied and private sector homes. So we need to see that happen much faster, given that it's been in the pipeline for a very long time.
Thank you. John Mason.
Well, just following on really from that very point, is my question is the continuity between the previous RPPs and what we're now seeing in the climate change plan. I mean, there's been some suggestions that, for example, in heat, we've made progress, we're easing off, and then we're going to make more progress in the future. But as overall, I mean, how do you see the continuity of this? Is this a big change we're looking at now, or is it very much continuing what we've been doing already?
So they've been produced in different ways. So I think, you know, I was involved in consultations on RPP2 in Parliament, and we were making the criticism then that it was very difficult to get a level of consistency across the sectors in terms of how the information was presented and how justification for the proposals and policies was set out. So the idea of doing it this way with an integrated model was to make that all more consistent. And there is, yeah, just presentationally, there's a nice kind of level of consistency about the way the sectoral information is presented. I mean, I think some of the things hasn't changed. So however you do this, whether it's a bottom-up sector-by-sector approach or more of a kind of optimizing across the whole system, there are some consistent messages about, you know, electricity first, the low-hanging fruit in terms of decarbonised power and so on. RPP2 also had ambition around CCS. I remember we made the very same criticism that, you know, there's a lot of expectation. I think RPP2 had CCS coming in the mid-2020s to a significant level, and we know, you know, that's quite unlikely. We've got moderate amounts, I think, even in the late 2020s in the CC plan for CCS. I don't think the fundamentals change really, however it's done, and I think we are, although we've been quite critical in many of the specifics, I think we welcome an attempt to try and integrate policy across the energy space and across climate change and across land use. I mean, that absolutely kind of should lend greater transparency. I think we're struggling because we haven't had the sort of all the data and the information that's gone into the government's thinking. I think what happens with a system model, you know, starting at the integrated version first, is it then goes to the policy teams and it goes to government, you know, the subcommittee, and they will then kind of put a kind of feasibility kind of imprint on it. So you end up with something rather similar. And I think we're not saying the move to using a more integrated version from the outset is at all kind of unwelcome. I think that is welcome, but it has its own kind of strengths and weaknesses. I think broadly I would, you know, just want some more information so we can sort of see what are the sort of sensitivities involved in the CC plan and so on. Yeah.
I think the clear message that seems to be emerging from, I think, all of us is about a lack of detail. So there's a detail in terms of how did this pathway come about. You know, so I think, as I said at the beginning, it's good to have an ambitious target, but it needs to be achievable, even if achievable at a stretch. So let's see how far we're stretching ourselves in the different sectors. And I think we've all kind of touched on that in different ways. And another aspect of the detail is about the implementation. What concrete steps can be taken, should be taken now, and some of the questions you've asked are kind of, you know, addressing that point really, and you know, for example, something that Gillian has talked about in relation to community energy and about the building sector and whatever. It's about the implementation. That's what we haven't seen yet. if what's been published so far is the starting point of a further process of deliberation, analysis, debate about the implementation, when we do finally get some concrete steps, then it will have served a very, very useful purpose. I mean, to return to the question about the UK government, this is one of the tricky bits, is that that level of policy has an enormous influence on this. And it is a key part of the implementation of any of this. You know, there's only a certain amount that we can do. And then, okay, within Scotland, we can make certain choices which will have social and economic impacts. You know, there are cost implications to a lot of these possible pathways. Many of them, over the medium to longer term, actually have an economic benefit. We haven't seen an analysis that kind of fleshes that out, but other studies have suggested that there is, and it feels like there should be. Then even for those, there's a question of finance. You know, how do you unlock the money? How do you unlock the investment? Who takes on the debt in the short term? So those are perfectly reasonable things to try to discuss. But there is the possibility that by embracing a very ambitious target, which is out of step with our immediate industrial competitors, we impose some costs on ourselves. Now, that's a choice we can take, but we should take that choice with our eyes open in relation to the potential benefits on health, empowerment, the kind of the general environment, etc. So it's, yeah, just to cut that short, next step is more detail.
If I may aid the committee's scrutiny by suggesting what kind of more detail we should see, in addition to all the things that Keith and Mark have spoken about. Things that we've lost from the previous RPP include clear abatement figures. So there were tables at the back of the EPIC RPP that set out what each policy was doing each year in terms of emissions reduction. That was very clear. It was good in terms of monitoring. You could see what was supposed to be doing what when. So we don't know at this stage either the relative contribution of individual policies or exactly what's happening over the timescale. So I think clearer figures on that would be useful. There were costings in the last RPP, which we don't have anymore, of essentially what budget would be attributed and what individual policies would cost. So I think a little bit more clarity on that would be useful. And of course, more clarity on the times output, as we've discussed, as well as new policy.
Okay, if I can have a supplementary. I mean, you've mentioned about the detail and the lack of detail, and there's also been mention of, you know, in a sense there's been a change in, I don't know, it's mood or fashion or swing. That, I mean, in the past, the assumption was, well, let's put everything onto electricity because that'll be good. And then one or two of you have said, well, that doesn't seem to be quite the way we're going now. And things like, I mean, it seems to me that, well, leaving aside carbon capture and storage, district heating systems seem to be kind of a bit of a flavour of the month. I mean, are we all convinced that that is definitely the way to go? Because I think we had evidence previously that, you know, actually the UK individual boiler in a house system is quite efficient. Are there really gains to be made with district heating systems?
The evidence on heat is really mixed, and I've spent quite a bit of time looking at what different people are saying about the relative kind of attractiveness of these different options on low carbon heat. And we're sort of at a stage where there are quite kind of you know, every option on heat has its advantages and disadvantages. District heating is getting a lot of interest in the Scottish Government and in the Scottish sort of energy community. I think there are kind of dangers there, and I think that's where we do need. So some of the scenarios suggest that it's a very expensive kind of infrastructure commitment, that you start kind of putting the infrastructures in, it becomes a very expensive kind of, step-by-step approach to getting the infrastructure in. There's also kind of concerns about where is the low carbon heat coming from. So heat networks are essentially a heat pipe in the ground, not connected to anything specifically. So the way they tend to be used at the moment is a gas CHP, combined heat and power engine. So the actual carbon savings you get from running that, assuming you get your electricity decarbonisation, you know, by the time you get your electricity decarbonised, and electricity is pretty well decarbonised already in Scotland, a district heating running on a conventional gas engine doesn't provide any carbon savings. So,
is one boiler it would strike me as a non-expert,
Yeah.
you know, one big boiler is going to be more efficient than 20 little ones.
Well, it would if you were just starting from, let's build something from scratch. You know, we spent a long time in the UK getting an efficient sort of national system of gas distribution, transmission and distribution, and domestic scale boilers. So the implications of going from individual householder to a kind of community scale heat system is quite a disruptive change for the UK. So that needs to be factored into the pathway. So what a lot of the groups have been doing, I think one of them is actually referenced in either the energy strategy or the climate change plan, some work carried out by KPMG looking at different vectors for heat. And that's, you know, that's quite cautionary on district heating. But it's one of amongst a number of studies of that kind. You know, and it's not that district heating doesn't have a role. It's likely to have a role in certain areas for certain types of housing stock and for new build especially. So what we need is, I mean, I was at a meeting in London looking at heat, and somebody from the new department, Bayes, head of strategy there, was saying the UK government doesn't have a good grasp of the evidence on heat. Didn't quite say that, but he said, we need to really get to grips with the evidence, we need to own the evidence, and we need to make some kind of sensible judgments on heat. And I do think that's the same problem for the Scottish Government. I mean, one thing I just say briefly is that at the same time as we've got the energy strategy consultation, we've got some specific sector-specific consultations. So Gina mentioned the SEEP consultation. We've got an onshore wind consultation. We've also got a local heat and energy efficiency consultation. And these are quite specific. So the local heat consultation is talking about granting or regulating heat in a new way. So local authorities will have the power to create heat zones where district heating will be the preferred technology, and what's called concessions will be granted, so it's kind of compulsory connect within certain parts of local authority areas. Now, what I find is that there's a bit of a disconnect between what we're saying at a system level on the heat problem, where there's a lot of uncertainty, and we need to spend quite a bit of time on demonstration and trials and looking at the evidence systematically, and then what's happening at the regulatory level and at the local authority level, there's quite a lot of ambition already going ahead in terms of we'll designate areas for preferred technologies. So I don't see those joined up very well, and we're not really, you know, we've got, so I think, you know, I'd like to hear from the government exactly how they're joining those two things up, what they think at the system level and what they're doing in terms of planning at the local authority level.
Richard Leonard in at this stage.
We've heard quite a bit about the decarbonisation of electricity use, and that we are almost 100% reliant on renewables. But that overlooks the nuclear question, doesn't it? As things currently stand. And I just wonder whether you'd like to reflect on where that is and where you think that might go in the future. What is also something which was alluded to by Dr. Winskill, I think, in the passing, was the fact that we are part of a GB electricity grid and energy market. So do you have a view on the extent to which we can credibly measure CO2 from the Scottish system if we're part of a bigger grid which might contain CO2 elsewhere in it?
First thing, I think Mark was quite careful in his use of words about low carbon, which would include nuclear. We depend absolutely on being part of a bigger system to be able to say that the amount of electrical energy we generate in Scotland in a course of a year equals or exceeds the total amount of electrical energy that we consume in Scotland in the course of a year, because there are times when we have a surplus of, well, renewables plus nuclear, and times when we have a deficit. So we depend on being able to balance out that surplus or deficit as part of a bigger system. And GB depends on being part of a bigger European system, and that, albeit the capacity at the moment is relatively limited. So that balancing possibility in time and space is really important to be able to maximise the efficient utilisation, cost-effective utilisation of the resources that are there. And in terms of the stability of the electricity system in the future, then that remains a critical part. And this is where there is some debate to be had about the cost-effective way of doing that. Flexible demand has a big part to play in it. More interconnection capacity with the wider continent of Europe has a big part to play in that. Pumped storage, other forms of storage actually, energy storage, and we come back to the bigger whole energy system picture has a big part to play in that. In a way, we ain't seen nothing yet by the time we try to decarbonise heat. This is why it is getting so much attention now. But it also offers some opportunities if we can store heat or the energy that is used for heat. It's pretty low-grade energy. We're not doing an awful lot with it. So if that heat demand can be dealt with, then the kind of cleverer stuff we do with electrical energy, we can do that. So. And just to return briefly to a point that Mark was making earlier about the comparison, for example, between district heating and condensing boilers. The energy efficiency should be better when you do things at a bigger scale, but the cost effectiveness of delivering a certain amount of end product, which in this case is heat, may be different because of the sunk costs of the infrastructure or the need to build up a certain infrastructure. And that's where it becomes a tricky judgment to make in respect to the electricity system as much as anything else. So some amount of schedulable generation, let's put it that way, still seems to be very important, at least on a GB basis. And actually, there were good arguments for saying schedulable generation within Scotland is important in terms of, for example, dealing with extreme weather events and the possibility of needing to black start the system. Now, schedulable could include hydro, can include interconnectors using the right kind of technology. It could include another kind of nuclear plant, albeit with much less degree of flexibility. It might include CCS. Black start could be achieved if you happen to be wanting to do it on a windy day and you make use of that. So it just I suppose the basic point is it gets a little bit more complex to think about what the right investment strategy is and the right mix of technologies is.
Would anyone else like to come in on that? I think Gina Hanrahan.
Well, I think Keith. Yeah, I think so. The current power system relies on 35% nuclear generation in Scotland, and that's increased as other the coal plants have closed. So I think the assumptions are that those will. I'm not sure what the retirement lifetimes are of those, but I think we're relying on those for most of that period in the climate change plan, and nuclear plants have been given lifetime extensions. So there's maybe a rather hidden kind of reliance on. Yeah. Well, I
can't remember when Torness is supposed to go. 2030,
I think.
2030.
2030.
Yeah. Hunterston would have gone before that.
Yeah. Okay. So. I suspect the assumptions are for continued operation of both plants out to 2030 and the lifetime of the climate change plan. Yeah.
My understanding is that the CCC scenario for the power sector for Scotland, which was produced in its March report, I presume assumed nuclear phase out by the early 2030s, by 2030, and showed that Scotland could remain a net exporter over the course of the year. We, as WWF, unsurprisingly, don't support the need for continued or new nuclear beyond that point. We have an evidence base that shows that Scotland can play to its renewable resource strengths as part of a GB grid. Integration is critical, and grid reinforcement to deliver that is absolutely part of the picture, along with demand reduction, flexibility and storage. There are a plethora of different interventions that we can make to ensure that we deliver security of supply, and it shouldn't always be generation first as the principle that we operate on, particularly given what's happening around Hinkley, the price that's been awarded to it. We certainly should not be banking on delivering new nuclear for Scotland or life extending forever. We don't need to.
All right, thank you very much. I think if there are no further questions from committee members, that's the conclusion of this session. Thank you very much to all of our witnesses for coming today, and I'll now suspend this sitting and we'll move into private session. Thank you very much.